Well, let's start, everybody. So I'm going to do a bit of a welcome. So welcome to this Dash Arts conversation. My name is Sophie Austin and I'm your host for today's conversation. I'm a storyteller working across theatre, film and audio, and I'm creative associate at Dash Arts. Today's conversation is inspired by Dash Arts' current production of Dido's Bar, an epic retelling of Virgil's Aeneid. This show brings to life this classic myth of migration, love and assimilation through the eyes of refugees today, and is performed by an incredible ensemble of actor musicians. It's currently in London and then we'll be touring, and we'll tell you more about that later so you can get your tickets. In this conversation, we'll be exploring how theatre makers and other artists bring refugee experience to the stage. I'm delighted to be joined by an amazing panel who will share their wisdom and experience with us today. So I'm going to introduce you. First of all, I'm delighted to welcome Kurdish, Iranian, and now Finnish resident Marouf Majidi. Marouf is a composer, musician, and is currently the composer of Dido's Bar. He's also sauntering about London with a beautiful blue sky in his background. So welcome, Marouf. Thank you for being here today. Then we have, welcome. Then we have Iraqi, Syrian, Assyrian performer and theatre maker Yasmeen Audisho Ghrawi, whose solo show, From the Daughter of a Dictator, explores the personal journey of migration from Baghdad to Beirut to Berlin to Britain. And it's on at the Arcola from the 24th of October, is that right? Or was that last year?
No, that was last year. It premiered.
Oh my gosh, they need to update their website. Thank you. But yes,
it will be back in summer 2023.
There you go. Buy your tickets now. And then we have Christine Bacon, who is a writer, director, and co-artistic director of Ice&Fire, where she explores human rights stories through performance. And we've got Josephine Burton, who I'm sure you all know, director of Dido's Bar and artistic director of Dash Arts. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. And we're going to kick off, really. And I'd love to invite you to tell us a little bit more about your work and why refugee stories matter to you personally. So I'd love to kick off with you, Yasmeen, if we can. Thank you.
It's very unusual that I'm kicking off the conversation. Why are refugee stories? Well, I think I would prefer to rephrase this. And why are stories about people who have had to flee or leave or make the difficult choice to leave their homes and displace themselves and seek asylum or refuge or international protection elsewhere is important today? Well, it's always been important because this has been the reality of the world for decades. There's been thousands and millions of people that have been displaced in other continents. But as of 2015, this arrived to Europe, and suddenly it became the refugee problem. And suddenly it became a problem that is visible to the world. And suddenly we saw governments around Europe that have kind of jumped on this opportunity to weave in the narrative of blame, to weave in their failures, or rather to use this opportunity to redeem themselves of some of the failures of this past decade or 2 decades. And today, 7 years on, after 2015, Europe has moved in a really scary direction very quickly. The rise of the right, the rise of what seems like a direction, maybe it's not so near now, but definitely it feels like we're heading there. That feels reminiscent of a time that we thought is bygone. So I think, to me, it's important to bring these stories, one, to remind us of our common humanity, and second, as a cautionary tale of what has happened and what could happen again.
Thank you, Yasmeen. I think that's what could happen again. And I guess I'd love to go to Josephine, if you could, and tell us a little bit more about why refugee stories are important to you and why you've chosen the Aeneid to kind of explore that, and how that ancient story is so relevant still today.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you, Yasmeen, for putting it so beautifully. And of course, it's just it is about stories, and stories about humanity. And Dash, I've always gravitated. In fact, in my own work as an artist, I've always gravitated to telling the stories of the experience of how it is to flee, and to sit on the fringes or on the outsides, and to be able to look into a society. And that's really that's really why I ended up telling the story of the Aeneid, and because a dash we go on these big programs of work, these big journeys of discovery, and then after the referendum result in the Brexit referendum result in 2016, and I became very interested in understanding what it means to be European and what we mean by Europe. And in the course of research, I met the wonderful Marouf, Sivan, as he's named on our screen here, his Kurdish name. And he told me his story of moving to Europe. And I had this moment of realizing that it's his experience of moving here, embracing the sound musically and the world of Europe through his work as an artist. And the encounter with the otherness of Europe from his perspective, and his understanding of finding a place, I'm sure he'll tell us about it very powerfully. His understanding of how it is to be an artist and to exist in Finland, where he's now settled, was just it's an extraordinary story. And I suddenly thought, here we are in Europe trying to understand who we are, particularly in the UK, trying to understand who we are in the context of being European or not being European. It's those people who move here, who kind of go through the journey and the experience of moving to the UK or moving to Europe and becoming part of our community, that who can tell us who we are, because they've actually gone through that journey. And in some ways, that can hold a mirror up to ourselves in a really profoundly important way. So I wanted to tell Marouf's story and honor it, but also tell it in a more universal way, rather than it being a personal narrative, which is complicated, as we know. And I'm sure we'll probably talk about how it is to tell people's personal stories. And so for a couple of years, Sivan and I spent trying to kind of work out what was the best form and way to tell his extraordinary story. And eventually I remembered the story of the Aeneid, which is like the foundational myth of Europe. It's an epic poem that links up the Emperor Augustus, the kind of great emperor of Rome, to the gods through the Greeks. It was a sort of written as an amazing kind of tribute and eulogy, and a way to kind of fundamentally ground Emperor Augustus as the great leader of the Western, like the Roman Empire. But it's also the story of a refugee from war-torn Troy who makes their way across the Mediterranean and gets to Italy and discovers that it's completely fully inhabited, and he has to struggle with assimilating and integrating into an existing society. And that experience of flight and journeying and enormous disruption, and then arrival and integration, is the experience of Marouf's journey, but so many people's today. I just had that kind of eureka moment of going, this is the way we kind of honor Marouf and so many other people's stories, at the same time as grounding it in that long journey, because we're all, well, most of us, there are some extraordinary indigenous communities out there in the world, but we've all moved, we've all been through a period of dislocation, including myself. Like my family came to the UK like a century ago. So it's in everyone's blood, and recognizing that and telling that story and reframing it felt very important.
Thank you, Josephine. That's really a wonderful background to Dido's Bar, but also your relationship with Marouf. And I wonder, Marouf, if you could carry on this line of inquiry. And I'm interested to know from your perspective as a musician as well, how much these stories infiltrate all of your work. Because I read on your website that you say that many of your songs talk about change and undefined futures, and it feels like that's the most powerful thing about these stories, is the undefined future of them all. I wonder if you could speak to a bit about that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope the sound is a bit better. Yeah. Yes, I thank you, Josephine, for opening our story and telling about how Dido's Bar got started and where we were and where we are now. I think how I see as our friend opened the conversation as saying, but it's more about telling the stories than about anything else. So I found this very fascinating. Just I need to go a bit further back, years before we met with Josephine. I started this project in Finland, which I got 4 years help from art management in Finland, that we had a project of going to different refugee centers and finding out about them, just listening to their stories. So I was very privileged during these 3-4 years to go into different refugee centers, meet refugees, not necessarily artists, refugees, but people from very different backgrounds, and talking to them and just hear their stories. Since every one of us has a very unique story, doesn't matter where we're coming from. It could be European, Middle Eastern, or South American. We have, all of us, we have very unique stories in our own way in our life, and hearing them, and especially if the person or persons are in need of telling their stories to the others. So I think that's just the amazing field of work, and there is still a lot of work needs to be done. And now that we're talking about refugees, of course, among the refugees there is unfortunately lots of stories and lots of horrifying stories going on about what they have experienced, how they have experienced, how they have fled out of their country, how they have left their families, and so on. But among all those sorrows and all those dark stories, there is also lots of hope, you can say, because refugees, like other people, they what they want is a safe environment to be able to talk or do what they can do the best. So if we're talking about the artists, I think as an artist, if you have the possibility to give voice to someone, for him or her to tell their story, it's just amazing. I think what we have so far done in Dido's bar is just this: how we can really bring up these stories, the story of people who have difficulty to tell their stories because they don't have a right platform, how we can tell their stories. So in this case, it was my story, but my story was a very simple example of hundreds of thousands of stories. And I was lucky. We met with Josephine. Not everyone has that opportunity, but what we have achieved was also to make this as a good example that it is possible. You can tell and retell your stories in many ways, and how I see the thing is also, because this is also kind of an example also for others that it is possible to work in not very convenient situations. You can move, you can run from your country, but you can still work, you can still tell your stories.
Thank you, Marouf. I think that's a really wonderful way of combining what Josephine was saying and talking about your experience. I'd love to bring in Christine here, if I can, to talk about your experience with Ice and Fire, taking those stories, working with people in uncomfortable, challenging situations, and how you've used that work to reach a wide audience. And because obviously Ice and Fire crosses a lot of different formats as well. But it'd be wonderful to hear a little bit more about Ice and Fire and your work with them.
Unmute. Can you hear me? Yeah. So for me, the journey started over 20 years ago, actually, in Australia. That's where I'm originally from. And there was a series of very controversial kind of policies and government actions when it came to people arriving by boat to the coast of Australia. Most of them at that time were from Afghanistan and Iraq. It was very clear what they were fleeing from, but the government basically said, you're not entering Australian waters, and pushed boats away and left them kind of stranded on the sea. And there was this one particular boat called the Tampa that
for 8 days, it was just on the high seas, and everyone was wondering what was going to happen. And at that time, I just started. I mean, I was a jobbing actor at the time. I hadn't done anything political in my life, and I just started talking to people like, "What do you think about this?" You know, and you know, there was a range of responses, but most people that I spoke to were just like, "Well, you know, charity begins at home," you know, that kind of idea. We should look after our own people before we look after other people. And when they polled people, poll after poll indicated that about 75% of the Australian public agreed with the actions of the government. And I couldn't believe it. I was sort of, oh, but aren't Australians nice? I thought Australians were sort of quite egalitarian, and, you know, it's a very big, you know, immigrant population in the UK. You know, over 25% of people were born elsewhere, which is quite high. Here it's about 12 or 13. And it's, you know, so I thought, oh, okay, I don't understand my own country. And I just started getting involved in going to lots of charity meetings and groups, and meeting people who had fled their countries and were living in Australia, and just trying to understand it a bit more. And it sort of, and then I joined a group of actors. We called ourselves Actors for Refugees. We didn't know what we were going to do, but we thought, let's do something. And we started writing to people who were in immigration detention. We just started talking and conversing, and, you know, bit by bit, getting to know people, and then those people offering to speak to us about their story. And because they wanted it to be heard, but they weren't prepared to stand up 500 times in front of strangers and do that, because that is a difficult thing to do. So they saw this as the next best thing to speaking themselves repeatedly, you know. So we started touring around the country. And then when I came to the UK, I started a similar project, which is now called Actors for Human Rights. So I guess for me, it comes from being a citizen that cares about what the government is doing in my name, and realizing that, you know, people who are forced to leave their country often are the easiest scapegoats. They're often the easiest people to use as political pawns, because they don't vote, they don't really count in, you know, in terms of what who politicians are appealing to. And they it's that dog whistle politics over and over again, you know. And I have found, because I've been doing this for 20 years, I really had no expectation I'd be doing it 20 years. I have found that you can affect people and you can tell them the stories, but they forget. You know, you have to keep reminding them, you know. And there's always going to be some new wave, some new political movement, some new agenda that comes out that uses those populations as scapegoats. And, you know, this has been happening for centuries, right? So I guess I see ourselves as you know, reminders and sort of delivering urgent news to people who need to hear it. You can't just do it once and go, oh, that was our refugee season, see you later. It's for me, it's become more of a mission to kind of keep reminding people and keep informing people, because this seems to not end. And it sort of feels like, you know, that Sisyphus who's putting the boulder up to the top of the mountain, and then it rolls down again. I sort of feel like sometimes we're a bit like that. But, you know, in many ways, Sisyphus, despite his, you know, story, he is a pretty nasty guy. He's kind of a bit like my hero in a way, because it's like, oh, right, yeah, you keep going despite the odds, you know. So that's where I'm coming from. But we do see people change their views, become activated, do all sorts of things because of our work, which is great. But it's not a one-stop shop. You know, you have to just keep going.
No, I think that's brilliant. And I think it leads me on to my next question, which is, who are we making this work for? Who are we telling these stories for? And, you know, having worked with you, Christine, and having seen a lot of your shows, you know, there's an array of people, but it feels like there's a particular type also that come to an Ice and Fire show or to an Actors for Human Rights show. And I wonder, if you could just say a little bit more about how you target or how you reach your audiences.
Sorry, unmute again. Yeah, so we do theatrical productions. We also do this Actors for Human Rights project, which is very much about, you know, it's a rehearsed reading, script in hand, 3 actors read the testimonies of people who've been through the asylum system here. And we've got other themes as well, but we're staying on this theme for now. And we do participatory work as well with refugee communities, you know, working on creative expression and that kind of thing. But in terms of audiences, yeah, theatrical production audiences are, you know, specific crowd. They come to theatre, you know, we know who they are. And, you know, if it is a very, like, I did a show about Sri Lanka, the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War, for instance, and a lot of people who came to that were from Sri Lanka or had Sri Lankan background or Indian background or some, you know, they're from the region, were interested in the region. They weren't necessarily theatre goers. So in that way, you can reach different kinds of audiences. With Actors for Human Rights, we tend to be, we take the work into spaces. So a lot of the time, the audiences are sort of sitting audiences. Do you know what I mean? They are there because they're connected to a particular network, and we are taking the work to them rather than them deciding to come to a show, if you know what I mean. So we do reach quite a number of different people that way. At the moment, we're doing a lot of work with universities, so people who are undergrads or, you know, master students, doing all sorts of things like studying medicine or studying the criminal justice system or studying sociology, social work, that kind of stuff, who, you know, who perhaps don't understand the intricacies of the system, but you know, hopefully this will inform their practice and work going forwards, you know, but they haven't decided to come to an Actors for Human Rights show. It's part of their course. You know what I mean? So there's that kind of thing as well. With the participation shows, it's a bit difficult because, I mean, I'm sure you all know, getting a group together that aren't professional performers and have their own lives to live is a tricky task, and you can't expect them to do 3 weeks of touring here. You know, it's just very, very difficult to do. So those kind of projects are much more about coming together as a group, you know, and the kind of therapeutic benefits and kind of getting to know other people. And what have I done there? And feeling, you know, a sense of solidarity with each other, much more than the show itself.
Lovely, thank you, Christine. I hope you didn't break anything in your neighbour's house. Yasmeen, can I bring you in here? I'd love to know about how you consider the audience when you're creating work, and who your audience is, do you think?
It's an ongoing question for me. Who are my audience? I guess who I would like to be my audience. I think the first answer is, I think, like most artists, I would like my audience to be the not usual suspects. You know, you'd like to reach the corners of community and society that are not in contact with, maybe that don't have direct access to theater, or it's not part of their lives, really. I mean, I always see, you know, myself wanting to bring and gather people who don't usually go to the theater. Why? We all have this dream, no? We all have this desire, because we feel like we don't want to keep talking to the same people. Of course, it's nice to keep talking to the same people. It's warm. We feel reassured. We feel validated. But we want to, I don't know. Sometimes I pass maybe by the bar that is on the high street, and it's just one of those bars that mostly older English men hang out in, and not many women. And, you know, I've never been there for a drink. I will be there soon. But I just think, like, how can I bring you to my show? You know, I'd be curious. How can I bring you to my show?
And will you do your show in the pub?
Oh, that's such a great idea.
I can see you behind the bar or on the bar. I mean, it could work, right?
I mean, yeah, but I have it. Yeah, it could work. Definitely, definitely. That's a really good idea. I mean, I've been working a lot in Newcastle and Durham, in the county of Durham, and it's the first, and it's been really. I spent quite a bit of time there, and I must say that I've also encountered like a part of the English society that is much more like that I haven't encountered before, like a level of impoverishment that I haven't encountered as well, a level of deprivation that I have encountered. I thought, you know, I live in London, it's such a bubble. Of course, I know that it's such a bubble, but it's always like, I want to, you know, I also want to make contact beyond London, as most people as well, beyond London, to the communities in the places that, you know, you cannot even think of going to see a theater. But it's not about just seeing a theater, right? It's about, I want to gather you to tell you a story. And I feel, yeah, it may activate you, like Christine said, it may change you, but I think that also, like, if I, as a performer, as a Generation Zero migrant, as a, you know, whatever I am, all the labels, coming into these spaces, it's also like, I feel it's important to make this contact. I feel there's something about this contact as well, you know, that gives a different perspective. Sometimes just having the opportunity of seeing a little window open up is powerful.
Definitely. And I think that's what's so interesting about doing site-specific work, or work where you go into communities and work with communities. And so I'd love to bring in Josephine and Marouf, if I can, to talk about Dido's Bar and the sort of site-specific nature of that show, why you chose to reach out to an audience in that particular way with this story, and then also where you're going to in terms of your tour and how those different venues might allow you to access different audiences.
Shall I start? I mean,
Please.
really, thank you. It was lovely to hear both Christine and Yasmeen's thoughts on this. I think about the audiences all the time, who the audiences are. With Dido's Bar, I really wanted to have build a show that had kind of exceptionally high production values, work with the absolutely brilliant Marouf, with his amazing composing world, and with Hattie Naylor, our playwright, who's like an award-winning, brilliant playwright. So really, you know, and a phenomenal cast, really sort of have the production values as high as they possibly could. An amazing team of people building our world, enabling it to happen, but also for it not to be in a conventional space. You know, we have built Dido's Bar. It really is a bar. We've got a phenomenal local brewery, the Husk Brewery, running, you know, like serving drinks. The audience will walk into our venue, which we've brilliantly built by Brian, who's our wonderful designer, also Australian, Christine. He's built our world, and the idea is to kind of open the doors to people, so they walk through it, like to a bar in the back of in the kind of on the edge of town. Dido's Bar is built to be, it's a place on the edge of town where new arrivals come to, where recent arrivals, immigrants, migrants show up in, like Aeneas himself, who comes off the boat and goes there first, because to respond to Marouf, it's a place of sanctuary, a place where people can feel at ease, and also meet like-minded people who might be able to help them and be part, you know, support them in their journey of just arriving in a new place. That's the world we've created, and that's the energy that we hope to make as people walk through the door. So when our audiences walk into the world of Dido's Bar, they're greeted by and they're seen by our front of house team, who kind of welcome them in and ask them, and sort of kind of playfully rest on an assumption that our audiences too are recent arrivals. They might also be looking for a place to live and a place to work, something to work, some support. And so we automatically like welcome people and see them in our world. And some people are like, yeah, someone gave me a flyer and I thought I'd come along. But some people are really up for that journey, or are themselves refugees, because we have had some refugee groups who've come into our show, who've been part of the experience of our project. We've created this in the most amazing location of the Royal Docks in East London. It's an incredibly diverse community, the audiences are very diverse, and it's been really important for me that we bring those audiences in. So we've got incredible amounts of discounts and subsidized tickets and free tickets for our communities who live in around us. We've built our venue in a factory in an industrial estate right by near City Airport, and the communities are coming in, and they're just also the front of house team who work in Dido's Bar are from the local community, and we have a guest slot every night from a local artist who lives close by to us. So it's been really important for us that we embed the show locally and ensure that they come in, and schools come in. Actually, yesterday we had a group come in from Hackney, so not Newham, which is where we are, but a little bit further north, and I overheard as they left, these kids turned around to their teacher and they said, let's set up a classic society, our school. And I was really, I'm not really a big Latin proponent of like Latin stuff, but I just thought the fact that we inspired these young people to think about the possibility of extending that very rigid curriculum to do something that could involve something at school that isn't just about like getting the grades that they need, felt like I felt excited by that opportunity that I'd given those young people to see something different in the arts. So young people are really important, the communities are really important, but also with the show, it's really important for me that the Dido's Bar is political, it's multilingual, it tells the stories of refugees at the heart of the show, and I really want that to be a kind of acknowledged, because there is so much not apolitical theatre out there in the world, and it's really important for me that we're doing something beautiful, moving, emotionally kind of exciting, gorgeous music, gorgeous story, but has an important message at the heart of the show. And mainstream audiences, I need to have their there's a lovely line, isn't there, of like comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. Afflict the comfortable, and I really would love Dido's Bar to be doing that, comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable, and I hope that we manage that in our work. And to answer your question, Sophie, yeah, we're building our space in the docks, but we're also touring with it. So we're building another version of Dido's Bar in Manchester next week, in Portsmouth, and Leicester, and in Oxford, and every time it will feel different. So this week it's in a factory in the Royal Docks. In Manchester we're taking over a new jazz club. In Portsmouth we're in a brewery. In Leicester we're in the YMCA in the middle of Leicester, and in Oxford we're in a sort of warehouse on the edge of town. So, and every time it will feel different, and all being well, we will involve young people and local artists, and who will have the opportunity to encounter the show wherever we go.
That sounds amazing, and what an amazing array of audiences you will meet, and it'll be really interesting to hear their responses and the different responses wherever they go. Marouf, as a musician as well, what is it like to sort of, who are you looking to engage with your music, and then to come on board with Dido's Bar and engage different audiences with your story? How important do you consider the audience to be when you're developing and creating these projects and your new work? Do you think about the audience at the beginning of your journey, or do you just think about the story you want to tell?
Well, I think as a creator, when you create, you don't really, and you shouldn't really think much about your audience when the process of creating is going on. So there's other important elements that, for example, the story itself, the text, the script. So those are more important than who is going to see or listen to this. So those are, I think, definitely a secondary thing. But when the actual piece, whether it is a theater or it's a music piece or other form of arts, when it's ready, then yeah. And of course, you have unconsciously, you always have this, that who you want to be your audience, or who you want to tell these stories to. So my own experiences, not necessarily in Dido's Bar, because Dido's Bar, we're talking about a big group of people, and directors, producers, and so on. But when I'm working in my own projects, mainly in Finland or other parts of Europe, I actually think always that I very much would love to take the piece back to the community where the story is related to them. So if it's about refugees, definitely my main target is refugees, them to see that, and because that will give them the feeling that, okay, they are heard, someone talking about them, and vice versa, they can also contribute in this new society or in their old society, the society they're coming from. And at the same time to the local people, that, as Christine was saying, because we have a very short memory and we easily forget things, so that for being a reminder, but at the same time to telling a story to them who might not necessarily know what's going on and what are the different stories. And so I think both are quite important, to take it to the local people, but also to the place where story comes from.
Yeah, lovely.
Was it this any answer to your question?
Yeah, it was. And I think going back to the sort of the root of the stories is a really interesting way of thinking about how you begin. And I'd love to talk about process now, thinking about that. I think Josephine wants to say.
Can I just jump in, because Marouf is so modest, but I just wanted to kind of pay tribute to him, because he's both the composer. So he's composed all the music in our show, and with support from the wonderful Riku, who has kind of thrown in some ideas along the way. And about a year ago, when we were working out like the ensemble, I was like, well, we can afford 10 people, so that's sort of 7 actors and a house band of 3. And then he's like, but I'm going to be in the band. I was like, oh, okay, I didn't know that. So there is a house band of 4 and 6 actors in our show. And Marouf is playing at every single show. I mean, he's on stage playing there in the band, incredibly like non-attention grabbing. He's very like, he's almost quite invisible in some ways to some people in the show, because he's behind the big speakers. But he's at the heart of the piece. And it is incredibly important for me, that he's not that for me to sort of to know that his story, and for our audiences, for our audiences who are there, like he's the creator of it, he's the initiator of it, but he's also the performer of it. So he is encountering our audiences and passing on to our audiences, like his great love and his great story and his humanity every night.
Thank you, Josephine. I think it does. I'd love to lead on with this question of process, and not necessarily knowing that Marouf was going to be in the show, but just talking about different shows that you've made and how you have created and played with people's personal stories, because I think this is the other thing about these stories, that they're personal, and often you don't necessarily work with Marouf, you don't necessarily work with his story, but you have his story involved and he's not necessarily involved in it. How did you decide to get him involved? And if everyone else, I'd love to chip in, maybe open your mics and we can talk a little bit more openly about how you've all sort of involved your own personal story or other people's personal stories, and what are the nuances of creating a piece of work with that idea.
I mean, it's a great question, Sophie, and it's very intricate and careful. You have to tread very carefully on these issues. I suppose I already said in a way, like I didn't. It was, but for Dido's Bar, Marouf's story of being out of tune in Europe was so powerful and universal, but I just we needed to be tread very carefully with how personal it could be. I mean, there was a lovely process that we went through where we told each other the story of the Aeneid. And there was a moment when we had it in English and a little bit in Latin, because I sort of have a vague memory of some Latin from years ago. And then Marouf had the story in Farsi and in Arabic, and maybe even in Finnish. But we sort of sat there and kind of told each other the story of the Aeneid, and then wove in, Marouf's personal experiences into that. Like understanding where they came together and where they really were quite different. And then we moved further away from the touching that personal life of Marouf, because just in order to protect him, but also to extend that reach. But it's really an enormous honor to have him there at the heart of the show, and it just informed the process. So for example, our character Aeneas is driven by like fate in a way. Like he's got to go to Italy, the original story, because that's where the gods have told him he's got to go, and he doesn't get much personal agency in that. Like he tries to stick around for a while after he falls in love with Dido, in that famous part of the story. But eventually, the gods basically put their foot down and they say, "Sorry, you're not. You've got to move on." And he's ripped from her, and she has a terrible, as people know, like there's a terrible tragic end to her life as a result of that rip. But really, he's not in control, and he ends up going off to Italy to found this new country in Italy. And when we started to think about kind of personal, how we would tell that, how we would sort of have the story of the gods and fate and destiny and freedom of choice in a contemporary way, both Hattie, our playwright, and I remembered the story that Marouf told us, which maybe I'm speaking for you, but his version of that is when the UNHCR decided overnight not to move him where he thought he was going to Norway, right, Marouf? Is that right? You thought you were off to Norway.
Yes.
You met the Norwegians.
Yes.
You learnt
yeah.
You learnt even Norwegian, and then overnight they just decided to send you to Finland instead. And that sense of like the lack of agency that Sivan Marouf had in that decision making felt very familiar in that classical way. Does that sound a bit familiar to you, Marouf?
Oh, definitely, and that's interesting because you were saying about the faith, and I mean, we in East, we have a strong belief in faith. That's probably, if you go a little bit back, you can see, because many of nature forces, and outside forces also they force you to believe in things that are not necessarily true, or partly true. So faith or destiny might be one of those. As the goddess in Aeneid, they are making decisions for Aeneid's future. I also thought that the United Nations is working in the same way as goddess, and so they. I mean, you can. I mean, this is kind of a personal choice. You can have that personal choice that, okay, this is a faith, this is a bigger faith which happening to me. Or you can also think that no, this is just the world how it works now. That unfortunately some people are in a situation that someone else is making decisions for their life. So which I think both of them are true.
Marouf, can I ask, when you were making this work with Josephine, did you have a conversation about how much of your personal story you were happy being kind of put out there? Did you talk about that at the beginning of the journey, or was that something that just evolved as you went along?
I think it evolved as we moved on, and we were as we were doing it, and because I mean, until we got the actual Aeneid story, maybe we had a bit hard time to really understand how we can relate this, and when Josephine told me about the Virgil's book, and I already knew a little bit about it. So I thought that yes, this is exactly how this should be actually, So it was, I think, because that story was kind of reflecting all the story of refugee nowadays, and the refugees story is very much reflecting of the old stories, as Christine was saying, this refugees and this movement is nothing new. We have had this unfortunately for thousands of years. It's been, and probably it's going to be there. So it was more about the artistic decisions rather than the personal decisions. So how artistically we're going to bring up this story, my story and this new story, and mix them together and tell a new story.
And can I just throw in, of course, that Marouf it is not Marouf's story on stage. It is Marouf has informed the story. It is very much the old classical story that we are telling, the love between Aeneas and Dido, the relationship between Turnus. He's not, there is no direct reference, and it's only, the parallels are oblique, and have been informed by more than just exploring Aeneas's Marouf's story. I mean, the wonderful thing about the original text, the original story of Virgil's Aeneid, is that there are two refugee narratives at the heart of that show. There is Aeneas, who's ripped from war-torn Troy, and there's also Dido, who has to flee from a situation of domestic violence in what is now Lebanon and Tyre, and she flees as well. And they have this, so the privilege and the opportunity that being able to tell two quite different stories alongside each other is very important. So it's not just one person in a world of people who were like, you know, Westerners, and there were two people's narratives coming together. Felt very important, and the stories that we have explored and understood in order to understand Dido in a contemporary way are very different to Marouf. So it's been, there isn't, I want to be very clear that we not only have we protected Marouf, but we've also protected many people's stories along the way, and the opportunity that returning to this classical myth gave us was that protective layer, the armor that we could shield people and look after our people with.
Thank you. Yasmeen, I'd love to bring you in here. You seem to, and I've not seen your show yet, but you're using your own story within that show, is that right?
I'm using parts of my, I'm using anecdotes from my story and from my father's story as well.
Would you trust other people with
still
your story?
yeah.
Do you share your story within your artistic practice to other artists to work with, or do you keep it very personally to you as an artist to share and work on your own?
The first thought that came to my mind when you said this is when we say when you said this was my story. I mean, wow, you know, each one of us is a book and volumes of stories. And I think this is the thing about also, like, just going back to this idea of a refugee story, is that it kind of how it boils down our story to a story, you know, what is my story? And we expect that that story would be the story of, you know, the journey, the journey from the home to a new place and the encounter, you know, like, I'm just, you know, it's like also the layers of the story. I haven't, I mean, of course, I come with all of my stories as a, you know, as a performer that is part of any piece, you know, I come with all of that encoded in my body. So it's not necessarily the details of my story that I've shared with other people, but definitely me as a performer have been there with all of my stories and all of the kind of, then the provocations that put into the space, they come and are born from that. The piece that I'm doing right now is also not about my story. From the Daughter of a Dictator is really a kind of a message to Britain at this point in its history. It's a, you know, it's a story. It's, you know, really it's a story of someone who has lived in their brief lifetime authoritarian, lived under an authoritarian regime, lived under dictatorships, you know, have a sense and a taste of, you know, living and growing up in that fear, remembering that, you know, one of the things about the show that also kind of sparked it was the bill, the crime court sentencing and police bill, and it's not in that order, and the changes that the government was proposing last year, for many changes, but one of them was for the protest laws. And I remember when I was reading the summary on the government's website about why they were changing these protest laws and what the, you know, the powers, the increasing powers that they wanted to give to the police. I felt like something, my chest tightened, and I felt like I was immediately thrusted back to this feeling that I haven't had in a long time, you know, being in Baghdad. That is what inspired this show. So it's not really a show about my story, but more of, what do I have to say to here? It's a bit similar maybe to what Josephine is saying about, you know, after Brexit, you know, asking ourselves, who are we as Europeans? Who are we as British? And maybe can we look at our reflection through the mirrors that the people who have recently arrived here are showing us, you know? Is there some, yeah. So it's, yes, I think of course, I mean, I'm a physical performer as well. I don't only mean that I perform physically with my body, but also when I create from my body. I trust my body to tell me the stories that it wants to tell, or the direction that the story that needs to go to, whether it is creating from, between quotations, nothing, or whether I'm coming at something that's already existing, like a text or a music score or whatever. So, yeah, and just one last point. There is, you know, there is. I wonder if more artists who come from a refugee background, who come from who are first generation or generation zero, or or whose parents are, if they have the creative license or the artistic license to tell these stories, not only to offer their stories up to highly skilled and resourceful practitioners, directors, how different, how different would those stories be? Would they be different? Would they look different? I'm curious to see more of artists who come from this background. Of course, not all artists who come from a refugee or migrant background are necessarily specifically interested in speaking about the journey of migration or the journey of displacement, but there are many that are. So how do we also give the space and the creative and artistic license for artists to do so?
I think that's an amazing question, and I'd love to bring Christine in here, because you obviously work with a lot of artists who have these stories and are carrying these stories with them, who aren't defined by these stories. And I think it's really important what Yasmeen says, and I think that's, for me, one of the things as an artist working with many diverse casts often, is that you don't want to just say, well, this is who you are and this is the story that we need to tell the world. I want you to bring your artistry and be the artist you want to be. Christine, how is it for you working with artists who are bringing these stories but also want to be defined as an artist in their own right?
Am I unmuted? Yeah. Yeah, everybody's different, I guess is the answer. You have to, it's a case by case kind of basis. With Asylum Monologues, which is one of the scripts we've been touring for years, which is the testimonial script. Most people, when we interview them and collect their stories, I mean, we have a whole process that we go through and everything like that. But once we've been through that process, they've agreed this is, I'm happy with what you're going to present. Then they're very happy to just say bye. Don't worry, you don't need to contact me ever again. I'm fine. I'm happy that I've contributed, and that's the end of the journey for them, and they're quite happy with that. But some people have different preferences. So, and it's usually people who perhaps have had some kind of performance or public speaking experience, and they've come to a point in their journey where they feel safe enough and well enough to repeat that story several times, to audiences of strangers. So you just have to assess, and they have to tell you what they are willing and able to do. And then, if they are willing and able, you do whatever you can to make that happen, obviously. I just did a show about Belarus, about the revolution there in 2020, and I cast, all the cast were from Belarus. One of the actors played herself. She's a poet, a Belarusian poet, and she'd never performed before, but I could tell from meeting her, and she just has a very natural presence about her, that she was the right person to play herself. And she agreed. She was a bit nervous about it, but yeah, I mean, when I presented her with the script based on the interviews I'd done with her, she changed about 3 words, I think. But I think it's simply because I just edited what she had told me and what she cared about deeply. But also I'd interviewed her not just about her political awakening in 2020, but about her as a person, about her as a you know, what her life was like before that, and what her life was like after that, and what she did, what she ate for lunch, and who her boyfriends were, and all that sort of stuff that informs, you know, a life. So I think that's an approach that I have learned works very well over the years. Yeah, as Yasmeen was saying, not just saying the only interesting story about you is this story of trauma and displacement, but you know, you're a person with a huge long history before this moment, and that all of that has informed where you are now, not just that one moment in time.
I think that's so brilliant, and it sort of relates to what we were talking about just before we started recording, which is that in sort of mainstream media, that there's a desire to hear from and read the sort of pity porn, as I call it, of these stories, and really those are the only stories that the mainstream media are willing to put out there. And I feel like as artists, we've got a responsibility to offer up a really, you know, nuanced and diverse and relatable and different, and you know, rather than these one-stop stories that have been peddled for hundreds of years. I guess I'd like to sort of go to a final question then. Is the world changing in terms of how we can tell stories about people that have lived experience of migration, of refugee status? Are we being able to tell a wider story, or because of the nature of the world, and as Yasmeen talked about earlier, the sort of narrowing of Europe specifically, are we feeling like we're being boxed in again, and we're having to tell particular stories about particularly, you know, similar stories, or are we being able to tell the more diverse and rich stories that we want to tell? Who's got a thought on that?
Can I start?
Please, Marouf, yes.
Well, yeah, I think actually we're living in a quite challenging time, in a sense that there is so much material out there. It's so easy in a way nowadays to share, to tell, to create, and to sending things out there for people. And that has got us to the place that people are not as patient anymore. You know, all this Instagram culture, the culture of scrolling up and down, and stories, and you know, so these short stories, everything has led us to the place that people don't have enough patience to listen. And this goes in many different fields. This is not only in the theater, music, or art field. So there is just simply a lot in the air or in the clouds nowadays, and that brings a very new challenges. How you really going to tell stories? How you really going to talk about what you have to show? Of course, there is still, humans are the same, the platforms more or less are the same, you know, but just simply because there is so much, this brings this new challenge of how you really going to tell your story, how you going to show it, retell it, how you going to find your audience, because just because of this a simple way. And that's I found very interesting, because that this forces artists also to find new ways of communication, new ways of telling stories, and new ways of finding their audiences. So I think this new challenge has brought up so many new opportunities. At least this is the way how I feel, that I need just to be much more creative, even though the issues are the same as 20 years ago. We might talk about the same things that's 30, 40 years ago, more or less, or 10 years ago, but the ways of doing it it has changed radically, and that I found very, very interesting, and actually very how you say that, very joyful, because that definitely needs a new approaches. It's not enough only if you have a good story or good piece of music to tell. You really need also to find a way how to bringing this to your audiences, how telling them and how to find them.
Can I throw in that I mean I have just nothing to add to Marouf's kind of profound question, which is I guess the question for all of us is how we tell stories that bring in, that attract audiences when there are so many stories out there. But also I think who tells the story is really an interesting question. And Sophie, you really asked, in some ways you were asking that earlier when you were talking about process. You know, we are privileged Dash to have, and for Dido's Bar to have Marouf at the heart of that story, who's been enabling us to tell, you know, to bring in that area an element of authenticity and honesty to the piece through Marouf's story, but not Marouf's story. And but there, you know, we went through quite an interesting process, and what I went through as the director of the show in the casting of our Aeneas. You know, who was our Aeneas? Like, you know, our refugee from Troy. Could they be from Europe? I was really keen to find a wonderful actor, musician who could perform in English, whose background was not European. We found the most brilliant Lassan, who's Moroccan, and Lassan Rassagoui, I hope I'm pronouncing his last name right. And we were very privileged to find Lassan, and he brings an extraordinary deep understanding of otherness, and also kind of, and not just otherness, being part of something to his experience of Marouf, Marouf's life. No, not Marouf's life, of Aeneas, the fictitious character at the heart of the show. But could we have had a European who was playing Aeneas? Could we have done the story of retelling the story of the Aeneid without Marouf? I mean, I'm not sure we would have done anyway, because he's so much at the heart of it. But, you know, could Hattie have told the story, written such an extraordinary story, if we didn't have Marouf there alongside us? You know, and that does, like that, you know, there are so many layers to that as a question, and there are so many, you know, like that. That's not just about the story of refugees, it's the story of trans issues, it's the story of women's issues today. I mean, you know, who gets to tell the story, and how do we give them a platform? It's just a big question of our time.
Thank you, Josephine. I think it is a really important question. It was also a really important question to keep asking ourselves in these times, because I think, at least in the, well, there's two things. There's like the more of the kind of UK, more Europe specific response that yes, things are changed. I think, I don't know if I understood your question correctly, Sophie, but I think yes, I feel like how we tell our stories is important. I mean, I am very much, I think that the process of creation for me is an exciting process as well. I'm very much into devising, into kind of non-hierarchical, kind of collaborative creation. So I really like to, you know, see, I always like to see kind of naturally when the group forms, when we work together, how we can shape it, and how we kind of naturally take different roles in the group, but how our coming together creates something. So of course, how also we create and tell stories is important for me. So just to give a very quick example, when I was working with Psych Delight Theatre on this satire, Welcome to the UK, we were an ensemble of like actors and not professionally trained actors who have recently arrived to the UK seeking asylum, some who had already refugee status. And it was the experience of it was the experience of people who have arrived to the UK, and their experience with the Home Office and the asylum process over here. It was an entirely devised piece, and it was a beautifully held piece, but it was completely devised, and slowly with time and with rehearsals, more and more of the stories of some of the members of our ensemble start to seep in and take shape, you know, with naturally, organically, with their consent. And it was just a beautiful process, a beautiful organic. There was a lot of trust that had to go in it as well. And of course, it wasn't such a big production but I think that, you know, so this is the how part of it. The who part of it, of course, has become increasingly important today, because we you know, you cannot, even the industry cannot hide anymore that there has been like voices that have been silenced, muted for a very long time, too long of a time. I mean, it's kind of incredible that we see a show like I May Destroy You, written by Michaela, I forgot her second name, which is like a predominantly black cast, and we think, oh my God, it's an incredible an all-black cast, a series, TV series that's, you know, revolving around the lives of Black people in Britain. It's like it's 2022, and we're amazed by that, you know. So it's, you know, like, yes, it is important who is telling the stories, and of course, who is telling the stories is like also means how are the stories told, you know, because, you know, as someone who comes from the Southwest Asia, North Africa region, you know, we've had centuries of, you know, Europe telling our stories, right? Who we are, what we are like, what we do, you know. So yes, this is definitely shifting, and it's a question I think we always always must be at the center of what we are doing. And also, lastly, these changing times, I think that these changing political times, I think that the artists should probably come to the front line more, you know, in times where I think there's so much hopelessness, I think, and not knowing where we're heading. And I think that really the artists can come in and become, you know, I think this more political art to me means as well, how do we imagine and reimagine the world, you know, and where do we find hope and where do we find joy? And I think this is also exciting for me about what's changing today, about how we tell stories and who tells the stories.
Yes, Yasmeen, yes, please. And thank you. I think that's a wonderful summing up. And I think I would love to just sort of end with everybody just giving a thought to where we can see those stories. So Yasmeen, have you got work coming up that we can see? What are you up to that we can see and support and go to? Christine, I'd love to hear from you and what you're doing next. Josephine and Marouf, tell us where you're off to, so we can come and support and see these stories, because that, you know, that's what we all need right now, I think.
Yeah, I could say from the Daughter of a Dictator is at the moment going to be featured hopefully in the Shubat Festival in 2023, which is the contemporary Arab art festival that happens every 2 years in London. So hopefully that's June 2023, where you'll see From the Daughter of a Dictator.
Wonderful. Christine, tell us.
Yeah, well, you know, immediately after watching this, you can listen to my podcast. It's called I Am an Immigrant, and it's just nice conversations with people who used to live somewhere else and now they live here. And, you know, their immigration story is part of it, but mostly, as I was saying before, we talk about their lives, what's happening, what they think about things, and they're all wonderful people. And yeah, that's one thing you can do. We tour with our Actors for Human Rights projects on a rolling tour. So we're always performing. So look at our website, ice&fire.co.uk, and you'll see what's coming up next. We just finished something in Scotland, but that will about the Belarusian revolution. We're hopefully doing that in London at the end of this year. So just sign up to and follow us on social media. You'll find out about that. And I'm doing a new project about the Uyghur population in China and what's happening there. I mean, obviously, it's extremely dangerous for people to speak about that situation in the country. So one thing we can do is provide a platform here where it is possible to speak about those things. And that's in the beginning of November. So that will be on our website soon.
And Dido's Bar, you can catch along the tour over the next few weeks. We're touring until the end of October, and then hopefully we will return again in 2024 for a further tour in the UK and internationally. We have a podcast with lots of extraordinary artists who we encounter as well, like taking a leaf out of Christine's book, a Dash Arts podcast, featuring artists including Sophie, who's spoken on the podcast before, and Marouf. Definitely you can hear more from him and his music. And then we're doing a lot of work with Ukraine at the moment. So we have our wonderful Songs for Babyn Yar, which is an extraordinary project with 3 brilliant Ukrainian actor musicians, and that is in Germany next month, and we'll hopefully be back in the UK. And in January we're working with talking of kind of political theatre making, bringing to life a staged reading of an extraordinary story of the families of 10 political prisoners who were imprisoned by the FSB in Crimea. So these are the kind of bringing their stories to life through a kind of verbatim interviews with the families, and we'll be doing that in London in January. So lots of projects. We can't avoid the politics, and it's in all our work at Dash Arts. It's really fundamental to us, to me as an artist.
Thank you so much, everybody. It's been a really joy to talk to you and to hear all about your work, and to keep the hope that you're all out there making it and doing it and telling stories that are so important to hear. So thank you from Dash Arts. So Yasmeen, Christine, Josephine and Marouf, thank you so much. And hopefully we'll have more of these conversations another time.